There is one book in the Bible which is severely understood, and really doesn't get the credit for what it is. It's the book of James. Luther called it a right strawy epistle, but it isn't. And in order to understand and appreciate the letter, we're going to have a look at James's family, James the man himself, and the letter itself. The author of the letter of James was one of Jesus' brothers, and there were other brothers in Joseph and Mary's family. Matthew and Luke tell us that while Jesus was still speaking to the crowds, his mother and his brothers were standing outside wanting to speak to him, but they could not reach him because of the crowd. So this was a crowd in Jesus' own home, so huge that the relations, James's brothers and mother, couldn't get anywhere near him in the house. And then John records this: Jesus' brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, so that your disciples may also see the works you are doing." So Jesus' brothers wanted him to go and spend time with his disciples. Why? Well, maybe we'll get a hint of that later. But the author of the letter of James was one of Jesus' brothers. Yet, in his letter, James never mentioned that special family relationship. In fact, James never claimed any special authority, despite his family background and brotherhood with Jesus. Why not? In order to understand one answer to that question, we need to look back at Jesus' own family and explore something that happened during Jesus' ministry. First of all, from Matthew 4. Now when Jesus heard that John the Baptist had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea. So Jesus moved his home from Nazareth and settled his home in Capernaum by the sea. Then, as Jesus' ministry was enlarging in Capernaum, and he was attracting bigger and noisier crowds, there were many people who thought that Jesus had completely lost the plot. Some saw Jesus as a kind of military leader who could lead a revolt against the Romans and thus free the Jews from Rome's oppression. Others saw Jesus as a political figure who would stand up to Israel's own religious leaders and free them from the rules and regulations that they had long put a heavy burden upon them. And when matters were coming to a serious head because of noisy and nearly uncontrollable crowds, Jesus' own family decided that they had to act decisively. Mark tells us this: "Then Jesus went home, and the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, 'He has gone out of his mind.' And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, 'He has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of demons he casts out demons.'" So once again, for emphasis, Jesus went to his own home. But when his family heard the crowds and heard the Pharisees, they went out to restrain Jesus because they thought he had gone out of his mind. Now the Greek word that's translated as restrain here in the NRSV actually means to forcibly seize. Therefore the translation is this: when his family heard from the crowds and scribes that Jesus had gone out of his mind, they went out to forcibly seize Jesus. Jesus' own family, mother and brothers, went out to forcibly seize him. And the way that the crowd were behaving and shouting strongly implied that Jesus was demon-possessed, and the scribes were fueling that fire. So Jesus could no longer enter his own home, and nor could he even go anywhere near his own home at this time. He could not go to his own home as long as his family, including James, were trying to forcibly seize him and to put him under house arrest. Now, James would certainly later find Jesus' grace and forgiveness in his own life. So let's think about James, the person. Once again, the author of the letter of James was one of Jesus' brothers, yet in his letter James never mentioned that relationship. In fact, James never claimed any authority despite his family background. And there is a second reason why James did not introduce himself as Jesus' brother in his letter, and that reason is actually the person of James himself. Early scriptural references to James, the brother of Jesus, show that he was a highly respected and trusted church leader who held a prominent place in early Christianity. James led a church of Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, and he spoke at a large and important gathering of apostles and elders there. Acts 15. The whole assembly kept silence and listened to Barnabas and Paul as they told of all the signs and wonders that God had done through them among the Gentiles. After they finished speaking, James replied, "I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them." Paul, later in 1 Corinthians 15, said this, or wrote this: "Then Jesus appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." Paul also wrote in Galatians 1, "Then after 3 years I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and stayed with him 15 days, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother." Finally into Jude, very late in the New Testament, where Jude begins his little letter by saying, "Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James." So James was a well-known and highly respected figure in the early church, but for him to have mentioned in his letter that he was Jesus' brother could potentially have opened a can of worms that could not be easily contained. The history of how Jesus' family had treated Jesus at one point in Capernaum was precisely that. It was ancient history. Furthermore, identifying himself as Jesus' brother could also have distracted attention from the issues that James was writing in his letter, and could therefore have reduced the letter's impact. So let's move on now to consider the letter itself. James's letter is placed late in our New Testament, but it was actually the first letter to be written, as James experienced firsthand the tensions of Jews and Gentiles being integrated into churches. James's letter was addressed to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, who were Christian Jews in the church in Jerusalem that he led, and also Jews in Gentile churches. James's letter was not addressed to a specific church or a specific person. Yet, the very unusual nature of his letter indicated that James knew that it would have a wider hearing among Gentiles as well as among Jews, and that it would be read in Gentile churches where Christian Jews had settled. James wrote to both Jews and Gentiles that were beset by a number of problematic issues around the integration and behaviour of Jews and Gentiles in churches. But James did not teach directly about Jesus as other later writers did, but rather he directly applied the teachings of Jesus to the specific situations in the churches. Although we must be careful about how we apply James's letter to ourselves in our day and context, there is no doubt that James tackled issues that are common to everyone, whether Jew or Gentile, male or female, and so on. I will briefly mention just some of the issues that James addressed. The first was trials and temptation. This was not primarily about sins or sinning, but rather it was about what a person's heart was like. Then, be doers, not just mere hearers. Merely hearing words is of little value if it does not then express itself in action. C. Partiality. A particular feature of the community concern of James is the elimination of factions based on wealth. And that brings me to D, the poor. James was vitally concerned with the poor and oppressed, and, in his own day, the poor comprised more than 90% of the population. E. Faith without works. Faith that does not find expression in action is an inert faith that is of little or no value in itself. F. The tongue. Words created everything, but we so easily forget that words can also destroy. G. The world's system. The world order of things stands opposed to Yahweh. It therefore stands opposed to you and me. H. Christ-centered community. James envisioned a Christian community that was composed of relationships of mutual care and mutual responsibility. I. Judging one another. James knew how important forgiveness had been for himself, and condemning or judging people denies them the reality of having matured and changed. J. Patience in suffering. The reality of suffering is the starting point of the letter. It is the theme with which James begins, and it is also the theme that binds together all the other themes in the letter. And finally, K. Faith and need. Meet the need, not be of good cheer. If, like me, you loved Peanuts, and you're familiar with Charlie Brown and Linus, or Linus, however you pronounce it, and Snoopy, there is a particular cartoon in which Snoopy, in his fur coat, as it were, is shivering, cold and wet out in the bad weather. And Charlie Brown and Linus come alongside. They're wrapped up in huge coats, big boots, hats, and they're nice and warm inside it all. And they look at Snoopy shivering in the cold and they say, "Be of good cheer." Charlie Brown says it, and then Linus says it, "Be of good cheer." But they didn't meet the need. So, while James initially addressed his letter to the Jews of the dispersion, his themes were, and still are, valid and important for everyone to consider. James's letter came from his heart, and one thing that James wrote revealed his own heart of forgiveness in Jesus his Lord. In James 3:2 he wrote, "For all of us make many mistakes." And you can say that again. So James was fully at home in the world of Judaism, and while this letter is unquestionably a Christian one, it has deep roots in Judaism. His letter has numerous and striking parallels to the teachings of Jesus in Matthew, Mark and Luke, but James' parallels are in an earlier and less sophisticated form than that which appeared later in the Gospels. In particular, James' letter has a lot in common with Matthew's Gospel, as they shared the same sources. James's letter was the first to be written, and it was written by the man on the ground who was actually doing the stuff in the church in Jerusalem, while Matthew's Gospel was a much refined later version that testified about Jesus specifically to Jews. Another close companion to James' letter is the first letter of Peter, which he addressed to the exiles of the dispersion. Nevertheless, both James and Peter knew that their letters would be read in both Jewish churches and in Gentile churches that included Jewish Christians, and Peter addressed his second letter not exclusively to Jews as he had done before, but rather he addressed it to those who have received a faith as precious as ours. But while 1 Peter used Christ as its hero of endurance and faith, James chose ancient models of faith such as Abraham, Rahab, Elijah and Job. James frequently used the scriptures of the Old Covenant and even quoted them, as well as showing his familiarity with the Old Covenant prophetic notion of justice. James's letter was written in good and flowing Greek, and his writing demonstrated both a relatively wide Greek vocabulary and also a real skill in Greek wordplays and figures of speech that do not translate into English. Yet, James' practical and down-to-earth letter also avoided the complex words and lengthy sentences that mark the highest Greek literature. James' letter showed that he was very familiar with the Greek world and with broader Greek culture, for he both knew and made use of Greek literary conventions that are again only visible in the Greek. His letter also demonstrated a real interest in Greek oral composition, as shown by his use of alliteration and rhyme that are only visible in the Greek. A number of the metaphors in the letter are drawn from the stock wisdom of the Greek Mediterranean world and are alien to the Palestinian context. James also knew the big picture of the Christ, since he wrote as Jesus as Judge, Jesus as Lord, Jesus as King, and Jesus as the Lord Almighty. Indeed, James declared himself to be a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. In his letter, James showed that he was free from the shackles of patriarchy as he addressed his letter to his brothers and sisters. So, what about us? Well, James' letter is a very practical and down-to-earth letter, while at the same time it showcased the wisdom and the intelligence of Jesus' brother. Reading the letter aloud in churches would not have taken very long, but the leaders of those churches would then have picked up on the issues that were relevant to their own churches. We could therefore sum up a reading of James' letter in this way: listen carefully to what I say, and then do something about it. But James never claimed any authority to write the way he did. He didn't need to claim any authority. He was a well-known, accountable, trusted, and highly respected church leader in his own church in Jerusalem and also in the wider community, and therefore he did not need any introduction in his letter. That is one of the many values of a local church, and it's one reason why the early church apostles were so effective in their ministries. So, let me finish by encouraging you to read James in a new and exciting way, and maybe watch the video again if you haven't taken in everything that I've shared. Enjoy the book of James.